Hello, I'm Professor Congleton, and this is part 3 of the section of material on neoclassical economics and ethics. So what we've done in the first 2 lectures is basically first we showed that ethics can affect sales and economic productivity through effects on the average quality of the output of labor, both through increased diligence on the part of individual workers, but also through effects of that increased diligence on the effectiveness of team production. And we also mentioned in that first block of material that if consumers can determine that some firms are on average more diligent, more honest than others, they will tend to shop at those firms rather than the ones at which the probability of being cheated is higher, or just the probability of getting defective products is higher. In some cases, those markets might split, and there would be a separating equilibria, and there would be a high-quality firm with a relatively high-quality workforce, and there would be a lower-quality firm or collection of firms with somewhat lower quality workforce in the sense of being somewhat less diligent, somewhat less honest, somewhat less caring, and I suppose to some extent about the welfare of their customers. In the second part, the one we just I recorded after I got back from my trip, having contracted a mild case of COVID, we basically started to think about how economics might affect, or economic prices might affect the extent of ethical dispositions in the community that we're interested in. And the analysis we did was a little bit less rich than the one we did using the matrices, because we could only deal with really one dimension of ethical dispositions rather than multi-dimensions, which is what we did with the matrix. But we were able to show that if we took the Aristotelian, the Adam Smith, and the Ben Franklin approaches, and we considered that they were all basically true in some sense, although they might be more true for some people than for others. I mean, that is to say, some people might be more Smithian, more affected by the desire for praise than other people. Others might be more motivated in Aristotelian terms by the self-esteem generated by ethical dispositions, and others may still be more affected or less affected by economic rewards associated with particular dispositions. So if all 3 of these factors influence individual decisions and family decisions about investments in ethics or ethical dispositions, then we can model an individual's investment in the ethical dispositions is simply that which maximizes his or her net benefits as he or she understands them in terms of praise, in terms of self-esteem, in terms of economic rewards, where all those rewards might be simultaneously affected by their investments. We were also able to show in that simple diagram that if economic rewards increased, that for a particular ethical disposition, then it's very likely that the average person will increase their investment in that disposition, and the community will gradually come to have more people who have internalized the disposition that markets are rewarding. So the next puzzle, the next chink in the piece in the puzzle to try to solve is this idea of co-determination. Right? So we have causality going from ethics to economic sales and output in the first one. We have causality going from economics to ethical dispositions in the second part. And today we're going to try to put the 2 pieces together and kind of give us a sense of how that equilibrium might look, at least to a neoclassical economist who are thinking about markets clearing for ethical dispositions, for labor, and for final goods. So let's talk a little bit about some of the basic neoclassical geometry. So what I want to do is to take some of our neoclassical geometry and use it to think about long and short run effects. And first I'm just going to try to draw a market in equilibrium. So there's some kind of demand for labor. And that demand for labor is going to reflect the ethical disposition of the average person that they're recruiting for that particular type of job. And there's some supply of people with that ethical disposition. And this you can think of as the long-run supply, which is the number of people or the strength of the disposition that would tend to be generated at various price points, holding other aspects of the determination of ethical dispositions constant, namely the Aristotelian one and the Smithian one. So we're just focusing on the economic effects at this point. Well, in the short run, there's not much that can be done to increase that supply. And so you can imagine the typical long-run equilibrium is looking like this, right? So there's some kind of demand for labor, there's some kind of supply for labor with this particular ethical disposition. In the short run, that supply is not very flexible because it takes a while to develop these dispositions, at least according to Aristotle and Smith, and to some extent Ben Franklin. And so the short run supply is more vertical, less elastic than the long run supply. So from this we can just do normal neoclassical comparative statics. If the long run demand increases, like this, possibly because of some technological innovation, what we'd expect is to get a short run increase in wages, a modest increase in the employment of such persons, and then in the long run, we get a larger expansion in the labor force with that particular characteristic, that particular ethical disposition, and a higher overall employment level of such people. Right, and since these have to be economically productive dispositions, otherwise firms wouldn't seek them out, then it must be the case that total output has been increased as more of these productive people are employed in the new areas of the firm required to make use of the new technology. Right, so. So once we have supply and demand down, short run supply and long run supply, we can do some comparative statics both for thinking about how this process might operate in the short run and how it might cash out in the long run as all these various possible adjustments are being made. In this case, the adjustment we're most interested in is the investment, the extra investment in developing this ethical disposition. And that might be partly because of on-the-job experience, where they just use this ethical disposition more and more, and so it becomes stronger and more habitual. Or it may be a conscious decision to invest in that particular disposition and to reveal it in obvious ways to firms so that those jobs come your way. All right, so this would be an example of how an economic shock, a technological shock, might affect the population of ethical dispositions in the society. Another possibility is that we might have a demand curve and a supply curve. And rather than having a demand shock, we might have some kind of supply shock. Like there might be an ethical innovation in the community, or perhaps even something that's generated by some intellectual that really affects the way people think about virtue. And the result may be that people invest more heavily in this, ethics, and so we get some kind of long-run supply increase as a consequence of this innovation. Right, so this is the sort of thing that Max Weber has in mind when he talks about the Protestant Revolution possibly having launched Northwestern European society in the direction of a commercial society. Right, so we have this increase in the number of people with this disposition, right, which might be the Protestant Reformation. But it could be other things. It could be the influence of just new theories. It could just be some philosopher, say Adam Smith, influences the way people think about ethical dispositions, or Kant, and as a consequence, literate people invest more heavily in a particular set of dispositions than they otherwise would. And the dispositions that are relevant, remember, are not just any old moral disposition. The dispositions that are relevant for economics are dispositions that affect your productivity, okay, in a particular position, right? And that could include things like diligence, honesty, the tendency to abide by your promises and other commitments, or a sense of duty that you might have internalized. Well, in this case, the effect of that supply shock is that the wage rates, or the wage premium for this particular type of disposition actually goes down, okay, at the same time that employment goes up. And again, insofar as these folks are more productive, on their job, it means total output goes up. And so consumers outside of this particular market are benefiting from lower prices, right? The wage cost of this particular input has gone down. And as a consequence, the industry expands, specialization increases, and it's possible that wages, because of specialization, would kind of rise and counter some of this effect. But the immediate effect would be that while there are more of these competent, honest, hardworking folks around, and so you don't have to pay them as much to get them to show up or attract them to your particular job. And therefore, you take a greater advantage of these people in terms of employment. But on the other hand, they're not making as much money as before, at least in this particular line of employment. Although it may be that because the cost of goods has gone down, that they're actually somewhat better off, right? As long as this effect is kind of common throughout the economy, it could be that the cost of purchasing things has gone down. So even though your nominal wages has gone down, it could be your real wages have gone up because prices have fallen elsewhere. All right, so this is a case where an ethical innovation affects economic outputs. Right? So this is more like that case one material that we went through in the first lecture, whereas the previous example was more or less like the case two example, where we're trying to show the effect of a change in market conditions on the distribution of ethical dispositions in the community of interest. Now, in the book, I illustrate what an overall equilibrium would look like, given these ideas that we've just developed in the first two parts of this block of material, neoclassical economics and ethical dispositions. And what we've just kind of reviewed briefly using somewhat different tools about those interdependencies that exist between ethical dispositions and markets. And to show an overall equilibrium, you actually need three diagrams. Okay, and they all have to be in equilibrium at the same time. And we're just going to draw the picture, draw the illustration that represent the equilibrium that, what an equilibrium would look like. Okay, and I'm going to start off with the ethical disposition one. All right, so there's some kind of individual with some marginal benefits of the, say, Smithian variety, marginal benefits of the Aristotelian variety, and marginal benefits of the Franklin variety. And if we add all those up, we'll get this about there plus there. So we've got something that looks like that. And there's some opportunity cost to investing. And so if we're looking at the equilibrium, then this economic benefit, this EF benefit, has to be based on the equilibrium wage rate and package of amenities associated with those kinds of jobs. Right. So this was the first equilibrium is the equilibrium in ethics. The second equilibrium would be the equilibrium in labor. And this wage rate over here in the labor market has to be the wage that influences marginal benefit from the Franklin aspect of the marginal benefits associated with ethical investments. And then the third equilibrium would be the output market. And there's some kind of demand and supply. And the result would be another market that's cleared, another place where supply equals demand. In this case, the demand, consumer demand, would depend partly on their wage rate, right, their income. Right, so I put that little variable here alongside of it to remind us that that variable wage rates affects the location of that demand curve. And then I take a look at E star, which could affect demand, but doesn't necessarily have to. It could affect, for example, the marginal benefits associated with leisure that these individuals kind of perceive, and that might affect the kinds of goods that they actually purchase. The supply curve would be based on the quality of labor, which here we're indexing with just the E star, the average ethical disposition of people hired, and then the total labor force, and then that would generate the supply curve for the final output good, and the price that clears sets those two markets equal to each other would clear the output market. Now this demand curve over here, you remember, is just marginal product times price, right? This is called the marginal revenue product curve. So that demand for labor curve is actually determined by, partly determined by output prices, because basically you hire people based on their marginal product and the value of the stuff that they produce. So the value is captured by the price. And so we have this term called marginal revenue product, which is just marginal product times price. And that's the source of this demand for labor at each firm's level, and as a first approximation for the overall market for labor. So you can see that ethical dispositions enter into these calculations here and here and here for sure. And that as ethical dispositions that are productive increase in the economy, for any reason you might want to imagine, it could be there are shifts in these other marginal benefit curves that increase the supply of ethical persons, or the intensity of the average ethics internalized within the community of interest. And those will affect the locations of the supply of labor curve, but also the demand for labor, and also the productivity of the firms, which affect these supply curves. And so you have three separate markets that are interlinked. An increase in E star here will affect this market and this market, and they'll both have to clear to be a full social equilibrium. Now, what does a full social equilibrium look like in this case? So what is it? I would say that this type of equilibrium is illustrates an idea which you might think of as the evenly rotating society. Society where there's a stable pattern of trade, a stable pattern of ethical ideas that are transmitted from one generation to the next, and a stable technology used in the production process. In other words, it's a way of thinking about that long-run, stable medieval equilibrium that preceded the great acceleration of commerce that took place in the 17th and 18th century in Northern Europe and North America and Australia. And so there actually is a real-world counterpart to this type of equilibrium that we can observe historically. And what happened in the 19th century is that somehow there was a kind of steady increase in these ethically relevant characteristics of labor, at least according to Max Weber and according to other observers like Herbert Spencer and John Stuart Mill. And that on average, the E stars increased through time and made team production more effective than it had been in the past, and that tended to increase output. Another type of effect, which we're going to talk about in the material after this block of material is done, or we're almost through with it. I'll talk a little bit about it in class when I come back on Tuesday. If I'm not completely COVID-free on Tuesday, I'll be there with a mask on, but I should be COVID-free by then. I'm almost COVID-free today. We're going to start talking about economic development and how you break out of this kind of stable equilibrium society and get into something that looks more like a spiral, where things are changing a bit every year, output is increasing at an increasing rate, the types of products that you can choose among are changing through time, and so on. And so that you never quite repeat yourself, things are always getting a little bit different, and in most respects a little bit better every year. So that's where we're heading, and we'll take that up on Tuesday. That's all for today. My apologies for doing 3 of these lectures recorded, but with the COVID, there was really no other choice. So thank you, and we'll see you on Tuesday.